Well, good evening. I'm Jacquelin Apsler, the Executive Director of Domestic Violence Services Network, and I'm very happy to welcome you tonight to our second event in our speaker series. And we're very pleased to have with us tonight the school psychologist Joel Ristuccia, who will be talking to us about fostering resilience in children who experience the impact of domestic violence. As you know, or some of you know, this series is an outgrowth of our annual appreciation breakfast, where we would take the opportunity to say thank you to all of the people who supported us in any number of ways: time, talent, financial, our referring partners in law enforcement and Emerson Hospital, our colleagues in the communities with whom we collaborated to develop programs for our clients, and of course, our advocates who are wonderfully generous with their time and their compassion, even through this COVID period, which has been amazing. In that breakfast, in addition to a delicious breakfast, of course, and warm camaraderie always, we also would give you the gift of education. It was an opportunity for us to have speakers or panels come in to talk to you a little bit more about the complexities of domestic violence and the insidious nature and, of course, its prevalence of domestic violence in our communities. It is a difficult problem to eradicate, and it's really something that many people just really aren't terribly aware of. COVID has allowed us to have a higher profile because I think people can identify with feeling trapped in their homes and trapped with things and situations that they have no control over. So we are, unfortunately, can say that we're a little bit more visible now, but it's still a difficult problem that many people just don't really understand. So we do take those opportunities to be able to share with you that gift of education and knowledge. Of course, we cannot meet together anymore, or at least initially for this year, and maybe, hopefully, we will soon. We're looking forward to that perhaps in the fall. But what we decided to do this year was to create and develop a speaker series so that we could still share with our supporters, certainly the educational component, but even invite others who are new to us, and we're happy to be able to expand that net and that network with us. I also want you to know that we are recording this event tonight, and everyone who registered will be getting a copy of the video emailed to them shortly after the event, probably within a week or so. There's also a Q&A after the presentation by Joel, and we really invite you and welcome you to please come up with questions and offer your questions and even comments in the Q&A or the chat box, and we will follow up with them after the presentation. At our first presentation in January, we really looked at the many barriers that keep victims trapped in their situations and make it difficult for them to leave. Nothing new really in terms of the basic needs always being an issue, but COVID has really helped to ramp them up significantly. So we looked at the insecurity of food and income and housing. We looked at serious concerns the people had about their own children and the schoolings, and also mental health issues as they came up. However, tonight we want to take a closer look at the impact on children who live in these situations and witness this violence. The traumatizing effect of domestic violence spreads out far beyond the victim, brutalizes family, friends, and colleagues. But among the worst impacted are the children. The children who witness the humiliation, degradation, verbal abuse, and physical abuse of a primary caretaker feel helpless, responsible, vulnerable, and constantly hypervigilant, all contributing to potentially lifelong complications with school, relationships, and a sense of self-worth. Tonight, Joel M. Ristuccia, a certified school psychologist, will speak to the effects on children who experience domestic violence and the methods for helping to mitigate their harmful impact. Joel has over 25 years of experience working in the public schools, and for the past 20 years, he has worked with students at risk for failure due to social, emotional, and behavioral difficulties. Joel is a consultant to the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative at Harvard University and is a co-author of Helping Traumatized Children Learn and Creating and Advocating for Trauma-Sensitive Schools. He has consulted to the Department of Psychiatry at Mass General Hospital, presented program model research at the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, presented for the Departments of Education in Massachusetts, Wisconsin, West Virginia, and Washington, as well as the University of Wisconsin on topics related to the impact of trauma on learning. Joel is an adjunct professor at Lesley University, as well as Babson College and Regis College. He is the lead faculty for the Lesley Institute for Trauma Sensitivity and has played a central role as instructor, mentor, and recruiter at the Institute since its inception in 2010. Joel also has a private practice focused on program design and supports for students with challenging behavior and social emotional disabilities. Joel holds a master's degree from Harvard University and a bachelor's from Yale University. I am particularly delighted to have Joel with us this evening and would like to have him start his presentation. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you, Jacquelin. And let me get my screen share going here. So, good evening. My name is Joe Ristuccia, and Jacquelin, such a thorough introduction. I don't think I need to say much more about what I've been doing, but I do want to talk some about how I got to where I am. I am a 35 plus year educator in the public schools, working in schools, but most importantly, working with the children in those schools. And I have always been attracted to and enjoyed working with those students who struggle to succeed. And in working with them, I've done that in a number of different districts. And over time in my career, whether I was working in Charlestown, whether I was working in Andover, Wakefield, Woburn, Winchester, these kids had common traits. There were common threads that really connected these students in ways in terms of how they presented and what would be appropriate ways to help them gain the resilience and the strengths they needed to be successful in school. And as I looked at into these interconnections across these various and diverse communities, the thing that began to come up was domestic violence and these students' experience with other violent situations in their life. And that led me into the work that I've been doing for the last 20 years, which is really looking at the impacts of traumatic experience on student learning. And what I would like to do this evening is really have an opportunity to discuss with you, the prevalence of domestic violence and related violence to children, the impacts that these experiences can have on children. And I think most importantly, how do we engender resilience? How do we as people in the community, not necessarily trained professionals, work with students to help them develop that resiliency to help them be successful in ways they want to be? So I thought we'd start off with a couple of poll questions. Jessica will help us with the poll, but the first question is, what percentage of our children have witnessed or experienced some form of domestic violence? And please just choose one of those percentages. And here are the results of that poll. And as you can see, the majority of folks are looking in that sort of, if you look at that 30% or below prevalence, that's about half of you. And then we have another 30% from 31 to 50%, and 18% of you think it's greater than 50%. So I want you to keep that in mind now as we move forward in our discussion. The second question that I'd like you to answer is, how do these experiences impact our children? And I would like you to check all that you feel apply. So not just one, but all that you feel apply. Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, I can see that you all are fairly savvy about the breadth and depth of some of these impacts. So that's good to see. So let's begin and talk about prevalence. And when I talk prevalence, I want to present or make the case that not only are our children impacted by exposure to intimate partner violence in their home, but they also in many ways can be, in many cases are in fact direct victims, or if you will, victims of this violence. And so I present data from a couple of important studies that look at the frequency of adverse childhood experience and pull from those experiences around abuse and neglect and violence. And if you look at the original ACE study, and I like using this study because it was done in a group of privileged middle to upper middle class individuals in San Diego, California. This cohort, if you will, on which this study was done mirrors quite well the socioeconomic demographics of the western suburbs of Boston. So this is a privileged middle, upper middle class group that has access to resources and the means to employ them. And if you look at these numbers, I take a little time explaining where they came from because I want you to look at some of these numbers. Physical abuse, 28% of the cohort. Sexual abuse, almost 21%. If we break that out by gender, it's 15 to 16% male, 25 to 26% female. In other terms, it's 1 in 4 females will statistically experience some form of sexual abuse, and 1 in 7 males. I include substance abuse, and these numbers, I remind you, are pre the opioid crisis we're in right now, because substance abuse in a household creates significant instability and raises the risk level of other forms of domestic violence. Watching my mother being treated violently, if you will, intimate partner violence. And often when we talk about domestic violence, this is the type of violence that we're really focused on. And in this cohort, it was almost 13%. And then neglect. And neglect, interestingly enough, children who experience neglect often present in ways that are very aligned with and consistent with students who've experienced more direct physical and or sexual abuse. So that's the original study. I then had the urban ACE study because they then looked at urban populations and add a couple of extra, if you will, categories of potential violence. And the first of those, again, is a broader range of witnessing violence. Violence not only in my home, but violence in my community. And this number is staggeringly high at over 40%. Feeling discrimination in my day-to-day life. Discrimination is a way in which folks feel they don't belong. It really isolates them, if you will, from that main community wherein that discrimination is felt. And again, the impacts of that can be very similar to those impacts of abuse and or domestic violence. And lastly, living in a neighborhood where I don't feel safe. They refer to it as adverse neighborhood, but it's a neighborhood where I don't feel safe, where I am worried and anxious when I leave my home because I fear that I may be in danger and bad things may happen to me. These numbers, I've seen these numbers many times, they are extraordinarily high to me, and I think represent the prevalence, the broad prevalence of these types of violent experiences in our children's lives. And if you were to look at the number of students who have at least one category of one of these violent events, that number is in excess of 50%. In excess of 50%. Over half of our children have one of these or more, one or more of these particular experiences in their life. And so if you think of what the impact of that is on individuals, on our children, you have these experiences, and these experiences can result in social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. It leads to the adoption of health risk behaviors, leads to disease, disability, and social problems and early death. Now, the original ACE study that was done in San Diego was done by physicians, and it was epidemiological to look at causal factors for lifelong disease and impact on mortality. And you can see that what they were looking for, they found as individuals, as educators, as individuals with children, we see the impacts of these experiences right here. the social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, and that adoption of health risk behaviors. Health risk behaviors are things like sexual promiscuity, substance abuse, withdrawing from the group, school refusal, staying away from developing networks and relationships. These are significant health risk behaviors and often happen as a result of these experiences. So it clearly has an impact. How does that happen? And I want to talk a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit about the impacts of these experiences on the child's neurobiological development. You know, this is a quote from Marty Teicher. He is one of the preeminent researchers in this area. He's done a lot of work looking at the impacts on the neurobiological development of children from toxic stress, trauma, and the types of violence we're talking about. If you bring anything from tonight, bring that children who experience these type of events can have their neurobiology altered. They can react differently, they can learn differently, they can behave differently, because in many ways the neurobiology has been shifted. And the underlying principles for that are fairly straightforward in that we are as humans the ultimate adaptable individual, and our brains are extraordinarily plastic. As we experience things, our brains adapt. So think in terms of going to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician, when you have that new baby, will say, stimulate this baby, beautiful music, give them a lot of physical contact, love. The pediatrician is describing a number of positive experiences to provide that child that will nurture the neurobiological development of that child to occur in ways that are pro-social, that are heightened cognitively, and that will really help them develop the types of skills and the types of resiliencies that will stand them in good stead throughout their life, whether school or after school. So think then of an individual whose experience is not that of what I just described, but is of domestic violence, that is physical abuse, sexual abuse, living in a chaotic household with a significant amount of substance abuse. And so what they're experiencing is not necessarily these positive experiences, but a lot of experiences that are for some perhaps frightening, for many frightening experiences to have. And so that then triggers our safety mechanism, if you will, the limbic system, that fight, flight, or freeze response. And as we trigger that fight, flight, or freeze response, it has an impact on the neurobiological development of the individual. You know, our fight, flight, and freeze response, that limbic response, I'm going to call it the limbic response so I don't trip up anymore. That limbic response is a very primitive response. It's located in a primitive part of our brain, and you see it in, every mammal has a limbic system. They have this fight, flight, or freeze response. You see it in squirrels when they are running across the street and a car comes, you'll see that squirrel freeze. You see it, there was a rabbit in my front yard the other day. I came out the door and that rabbit froze. You can see that limbic response happening. And so this is a fairly primitive part of our brain. It is not that thoughtful part of our brain, those cerebral cortex where we think and analyze and compare and contrast. It is a primitive, keep me safe part of my brain. And as we stimulate that through these experiences, what happens over time is that it's those parts of our brain, the limbic system related parts of our brain, those non-thoughtful, those non-feeling parts of our brain that get developed and interconnected. And over time, what happens is that chronic stimulation lowers the threshold to trigger a limbic response. So now you're getting even more limbic responses to less than what we would consider, adverse experience. For example, a student walking into a classroom and their head is spinning with maybe what just happened to them at home, and their limbic threshold is low, and I say good morning and interrupt their thinking, and I might get not a good morning back, but some sort of unrepeatable phrase that is basically telling me to leave them alone. And they're operating in survival brain. And as that happens to them more and more, they more and more sink and work into this survival brain mode. The thing I want to also share with you is that plasticity works both ways. So if we can have that individual child be in a situation where they feel safe, where they feel nurtured, it will have them react in a way that some of the positive aspects of their brain development can occur as well. So the fact that you have students who have these experiences, whether at home or in the neighborhood, does not mean that they are now forever banned to this limbic, downward limbic cycle. In fact, by providing safe and supportive environments and supportive adults and relationships, we can help them work out of that. But we'll get to more of that later. Let me give you an example of what this looks like. This is a slide from one of Dr. Teicher's studies. And you can see this is an MRI slide of a student's brain. You see the eye sockets at the top of the slide. And at the bottom of the slide, you see that large sort of medium gray area, which is the child's cerebellum. And the cerebellum is the part of our brain that is sort of that automatic pilot. And it mediates respiration rate, pulse, blood pressure, hunger, sleep. It's all mediated through that cerebellum. Like I said, it is that automatic pilot, if you will, of our brains. And it is also part of the limbic system. And the individuals in this study had their blood stained so that if they had blood infusion into a brain system, which is activation of that brain system, it would show red and green. And you can see in this slide that that cerebellum is gray. There's no red and green. There's no blood infusion. So this child with no known history of domestic violence, their limbic system is quiet. Now, I want to show you the same slide of a child with a known history of domestic violence. And you'll see, first of all, that this is a very fuzzy slide because that child was moving in the MRI machine. The researchers told me they were lucky to get the slide. But you'll see that that cerebellum is lit up like a Christmas tree. It's red and green. What you're looking at is the neurobiology of hypervigilance. This is a child who's sitting right on the edge. A child who would explode in unexpected and inappropriate ways. This is a picture of hypervigilance, hyperarousal, call it what you will. So there is a neurobiological component to this. There's also a functional component to these experiences and the impact they have on our behavior, our learning, and our relationships. And as you all pointed out so graphically on that second question, the impacts of these experiences, domestic violence and related abuse types of experiences, are very broad and very deep for our children. If you just look at things like academic performance as a competency in school, the impact of these experiences in academic performance can be significant, starting with language delays, memory issues, including things such as cause and effect relationships, being able to develop a sequenced cause-effect chronology when reading a story or even telling a story. The other area that can be impacted academically is sort of that learning process. You know, think executive function, goal, plan, do, review. You know, executive function is goal-directed behavior. I have a goal, I develop a plan to achieve that goal, I execute the plan, and then I review, how did that work for me? And if I was successful in achieving the goal, I would then store that, if you will, that plan away. So the next time I wanted to achieve that goal, I at least had a starting basis. And of course, what I just described was a remembered sequential cause-effect set of steps to achieve my goal. So if I struggle with memory, I struggle with cause effect, I struggle with language and the articulation that goes with language, it can be very difficult for me to develop meaningful executive function skills across all the things that I do. The other piece that often comes up with students with these significant violent experiences is that they struggle with attention. I mean, oftentimes they'll carry an ADHD diagnosis, but what we find is that it's not that they're not paying attention, it's that they're paying attention to all the wrong things. They're paying attention to tone of voice. They're paying attention to physical distance. They're paying attention to sounds and noises that we might be blocking out. In a sense, they're paying attention to all of those stimuli that historically have meant for them that bad things might happen. So it's not that they're not paying attention, it's that they're paying attention in ways to help keep themselves safe, given their history and their experience. Behavior. Oftentimes, folks will look at individuals impacted by these types of experiences and view their behavior as impulsive, as erratic, rapid, unexpected mood shifts. And that certainly can be something that we see. That, that student's brain that we looked at would certainly, that hypervigilant brain, that individual is someone who's going to respond in unexpected and extreme ways. Children can also learn that one way they can keep themselves safe is by pushing back, by being aggressive, by saying no, by exerting some form of control in the current situation. And if they can exert control by pushing back, that helps them feel a little safer, that now they're gaining some control in that situation. And these two groups of students, those that are pushing back to gain control, and those who are overreactive, hypervigilant, those are students who I've worked with throughout my career. And to be honest, I love those students because it's like they're raising their hand. These children are telling us, I'm having a problem. There's no secret. There is a third category of student. And this is the child, if you will, who's learned to keep it under the radar, that they stay safe by complying, by doing the best they can, by not making any waves, and they just sort of kind of cruise through life. And these students are among us, and we would have no idea by their presenting behavior that they were experiencing anything, in the home. And I'm going to share an experience I had when I was first working in a public school as a psychologist. And in addition, and my office was in the guidance department, and the guidance secretary, I was working mostly with children in special ed. She decided I needed to meet some of the regular students in the high school. And she did me a big favor by introducing me to them. And as I got to meet some of these students, I met this one girl, and she and I got along. It was easy to talk. We had fun. Conversations were bright and easy. It was fun to chat. And she would come see me 3-4 days a week in the morning before school started. We'd have our little chats, and she'd go off to class. And, I met her beginning of her junior year. When she graduated, I went to graduation. I wished her the best. And, I figured, she's off and away. 12 years later, I received a letter, handwritten letter in the mail. I don't know about you. I noticed handwritten letters. And I looked at the return address and looked at the name and knew the name was familiar, but it probably took me 5-10 minutes to remember who it was. And that's how far off my radar she had been. And I opened the letter, and the letter was, "Dear Joe, thank you for being there for me. My dad was physically abusing me at home. School was my safe place. And our conversations every morning were the opportunity for me to exhale before I came into school. It was my opportunity to recognize I'm going to be safe for the next 6 to 7 hours while I'm in school." So behavior. And the last piece is relationships. All the things that impact, academics, all those pieces around the behavior that can be annoying, both within a school, athletic team, or community setting, they also show up in their relationships with other kids. Who wants to be the friend of someone whose mood can shift rapidly and unexpectedly? Who's always got things spinning in their head, they're hypervigilant in there, more than very frequently are overreacting and making mountains out of molehills. Who wants to be that person's friend? Or the individual whose language skills are not quite what they should be, and they have trouble telling a joke. They have trouble telling a story, getting the sequence and the details in the right order. It can be very difficult. These students want relationships, but oftentimes these children will have acquaintances, but no close, tight relationships. So the impacts are broad and deep. So it's highly prevalent. It can impact neurobiology. It can impact functional presentation of children. So what do we do? And the what do we do comes in two areas, and they're very interrelated. The first is thinking in terms of whole child, and really encouraging and helping children address and work with all of the skills and talents they have across the whole child. The second piece is to understand and appreciate the importance of community and the connection of children to community. That this is not in any way meant to downgrade or denigrate in any way, shape, or form the importance of individual supports, whether it's therapeutic, academic, or educational. Please don't get me wrong. I am not saying that those are not important and necessary. For many children, they are incredibly important. This is to say that to complement that work, providing students with a community where they can feel accepted and where they feel they belong is incredibly powerful. So let's talk a little bit about these two pieces. When I'm talking about child-centered model, the whole child, I am talking about these four elements. You know, this comes from a lot of the research done at Children's Hospital on trauma, the ARC model, attachment, relationships, attachment, regulation, and competency. And we took that model into work we were doing in schools and found out very quickly that there's another element of whole child, which is physical health and well-being. And the physical health and well-being, I mean, think of yourselves when you're feeling healthy and you're feeling great and you're going to work and you're really ready to take on the day. I know when I'm feeling healthy and I'm going to work and I'm going into a school and I know I've got some meetings that day with families or children, I am bring it. Like, let's do this. I like the work I do. I'm challenged by it, and I'm excited to get to it. Then I think of those days when I'm less than 100%, and I'm not even sure I should go to work, but I remember that meeting that took us months to set up, and I have to be there, and I'm going in, and on those days, my mantra, if you will, is not bring it, let's do this. My mantra is do no harm. And our kids are the same way. They have their days where they're feeling good and they have their days where they're a little off. So that physical health and well-being is important. Competency, and when I say competency, I'm not just talking academics, I'm talking Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences. You know, the musician. You know, I always wanted to play a musical instrument, and I am, let me see, how can I say this in a way that is growth mindset? I am a developing musician. Let me say that. I love music. I've never been successful at playing it. And yet I have a roommate in college who decides he wants to play the guitar and join a band. And I wish him luck because I've tried to do that in my own life and been very unsuccessful. And he goes out, gets a guitar, and 3 months later he's in a band and he's good. He has the competence. Or the artist, the individual that can, have that artistic sense, that can draw something like what it looks like, or can identify which colors are going to look good here, there, or in contrast with each other. These competencies are very important, and knowing our children's competencies and valuing them is central and critical to that child's sense of self and sense of identity. Relationships. Think of your social networks. What are our children's social networks, and how do we help expand them? It is our social networks that are very important to who we are and where our supports come from. And then lastly is self-regulation. in terms of the whole child. And self-regulation is that convergence, if you will, of self-awareness. I understand that I am getting agitated and excited. I am getting angry, that self-awareness of my feeling state, and then having a set of social skills that I can employ to either execute on my feeling state, if that's a decision I want to make in my self-aware state, or to tone that feeling state down, or to, hold it together for a bit till I can get to a place where I can let it out, right? So it's that convergence of self-awareness and that convergence of self-awareness with social skill. And so that self-regulation piece is an equally important piece. And then in working with children, helping them develop all these elements that are unique for them is a critically important piece. So as we work with our children, it's relationship, it's their competencies, it's their feeling healthy and well, and helping them self-regulate and learn the skills to do that are important to helping them develop their resilience. The second piece I want to talk about in this model of how do we address this is the power of community. If you look at the impact of trauma, community and strong connection to community is the single most significant resiliency factor you can give someone who's experienced severe trauma. And so if you look at communities, our children between schools, athletic programs in town, boys and girls clubs, YMCAs, fill in the blank, 4-H club, dance groups. There are a number of different communities our children can belong to. And helping our children create strong connections in these communities to feel safe and connected, not only to the peers, but to the adults in those communities, help them get a sense of belonging. This is my community. I belong here. Again, I ask you to think of your own lives and think of those communities where you feel that comfortable with, whether it's your family, whether it's a neighborhood group, whether it's a team, a group you work with at work, where there is this high level of connectedness, this high level and sense of belonging. It's very powerful. That one person, can't provide the resiliency for a child who is struggling. We all need to participate in what ways we can. To think that the therapist meeting with the child once or twice a week, if that, it's usually once a week or once every other week, is going to be the one who's going to provide this child resiliency it's certainly part of, and again, it's certainly part of, a well thought out and well planned program, but there needs to be some help for that therapist, for that counselor with that child. And if you think about putting these different pieces together in terms of the importance of community, I would ask you to think about yourself. And when things are good, where do you go to celebrate? Colleagues, family, friends? Go to your social networks, your communities. And when you need support, where do you go? Same place. Colleague, friends, family, your social networks. And what I'm suggesting is that we need to provide those communities, those social networks for our children, support them in developing those diverse and networks of belonging and connection. The other reason about the importance of community, and I think this also relates to how we work with all of our kids, is that we never know all the children who've been affected by domestic violence and other traumatic events. We just don't know who they are. There's no way to know that. I think of that girl that I talked about who I knew in high school, and she is the poster child for this. No one had a clue that this child was dealing with what she was dealing with. She presented as a average B+ student. She was involved in athletics and various activities around the school. There was no way to know or even understand. And yet, my making that time serendipitously turned out to be a piece that she needed to get through her high school years so she could get to college and get out of the house. And lastly, and I think this is an important piece, that a trauma-informed approach to working with our children and with each other, to be honest, but with our children, isn't just something we target to kids who've had significant domestic violence in their life. It's good for everyone. Who doesn't like to get a friendly greeting? And let's take a look at some of, what the principles are of trauma-informed practice. And this comes right from SAMHSA, and I gave you the URL for this. But this is, what they consider the principles of trauma-informed practice. That there's a sense of safety, that there is trustworthiness and transparency. There's no hidden agendas. There's no beating around the bush. It is compassionate, straightforward honesty and transparency. That we collaborate, that we are collaborating with our children, and mutuality, to me, I translate that to mean mutual respect. I respect you as a child, and I am hoping that you will respect me as an adult. And we each have our roles. It's not that the child is going to begin to tell us how to run the household or anything, but there is that respect for that child's competencies, for that child's issues, for all the pieces that make up that child. And that we work collaboratively. If there's an issue, let's have that discussion. And that collaboration and mutual respect feeds into that sense of empowerment, voice, and choice. Listen to what our children are telling us. In all of this COVID work around schools, and people are wondering, how do we open schools? What's the right way to do it? I have been struck by how few folks have reached out to ask our kids, our students, what would be important to them in the return to school. And when in fact it's been done, you find that the student's sense of what would be important to them is very aligned with a very robust program of not only academics, but social emotional well-being and connection. So what does this look like? And I'm moving a little quicker because I want to save a little time for Q&A. But what does this trauma-informed look like on a day-to-day piece? And I mentioned it earlier, a simple greeting, eye contact and a hello, and an upbeat hello, like that implies, I'm glad to see you. I'm glad you're here. Listening to our children and what they're telling us, and not just our children in the family, but children who we're in contact with. What are they saying? Both in words and, if you will, at that higher process level. Choice. And, when I think in terms of choice, one of the things that occurs to me is choice can be a lot about how we frame, or if you will, reframe situations. For example, when we're working with folks who've experienced domestic violence, what is the difference for that individual if I refer to them as a victim or refer to them as a survivor? And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but how you frame it has a lot to do with how it is perceived. How about if when we're working with our children and they're working in groups or whatever, what is the difference in framing something as how do we find a win-win solution as opposed to a zero-sum solution? Now, I'm not suggesting that for athletics. I'm not going to go down that road because in athletics, it is a zero-sum game. But in so many other parts of life, it can be a win-win. How do we work together and both feel that sense of accomplishment? Helping children feel a sense of belonging. I am glad you're here. This is where you belong. I think of, I'm very fortunate to have grandchildren who live very close to me. And I know with one of my grandchildren, he's got a little bit of a language issue and he struggles a little bit in school. So he's in a preschool program in his town, and it's a great program with great teachers. And I go out of my way to say to him how precious he is to me because I want him to understand how much he belongs. He historically has had a lot of trouble dealing with peers because of the language, although that's improving vastly, and just feel that he needs to hear that you are important, you do have value. And the last piece I wanted to talk about is assuming good intent. You know, one of the most insightful psychiatrists ever worked with, Jeff Bostic, would often talk about good intentions gone awry. You know, most students, most kids, when they do things, there's a good reason why they're doing it. You know, children who do things with no motivation, with no connection to why am I doing this, you know, I think that is one of the presenting issues around a child who might be, you know, suffering from some serious mental illness. Fortunately, most of our kids are not in that situation. So there is intent, and oftentimes just getting to know that child well enough to understand, to have them explain that intent can help them reframe and find solutions that are win-win. So I thank you for listening to my, you know, I called it a discussion, but so far it's just been me chatting at you, and I appreciate it, and hope that I've been able to provide a sense of the prevalence of our children's experience, not only in terms of witnessing traditional intimate partner violence, but also the abuse and some of the violence they experience in addition to that. And then the impacts that can have on them, and that our work in helping them build resilience is foundationally based on those trauma-informed values, and finding those little things during the day, whether it's a greeting, whether it's you know, helping them feel that they belong, recognizing achievement, whatever that small piece might be, goes a long way towards helping them build the resilience they need to be successful. So I thank you very much for taking some time to listen to me, and let's see if we have some time for questions.
Yes, we do. Can you hear me, Joe?
I can.
Okay. The first question is, how would I know if there is DV in a child's home?
You know, the answer to that question is you don't know. And I'm not sure there's any way to find out definitively one way or the other. And I think one of the reasons that I talk about the importance of the community approach is that not knowing, but treating everyone as if in a trauma-informed way, if you will, provides this universal approach to our children that whether there is domestic violence or there isn't, is going to fit and build resiliency in our kids.
Mm-hmm. Like you did with that young girl.
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. The next anonymous question is, I'm worried about a child I know, but I'm not trained as a professional and I don't feel qualified. So how do I support them, and what can I do?
You know, if you know the child and you're concerned about them, again, I would avoid going on the detective mission of trying to discover what's going on, et cetera, and be an ally to that child. Mm-hmm. Be a friend, develop a relationship. And again, don't go overboard. Don't try to, I use the term ally because it's not that you want to do everything for that child, but you want to let that child know that you're here, and that you'll listen if they want to talk, and that you're glad to see them, and that you're an adult that, is part of their life, and an adult that is a positive adult, and is an adult that they can trust.
Yeah, that's good advice for adults as well in similar situations.
Yes, absolutely.
One more question here from Jessica. Would all of this apply to emotional abuse?
Yes.
As well?
Absolutely. I in the work that I did for this evening, I tried to keep things focused on more of the violence side of things, but the implementation of community-based trauma-informed practice is not only works for those who have experienced these types of violence, but also for those with emotional scars. The research on the impact of emotional issues is not unlike that on physical violence and sexual violence, and some of the things we're talking about here, and witnessing that. And so in many ways, it is that same sense of belonging and connection that is just so powerful. And so even with emotional abuse, it provides that opportunity for that student to feel that child to feel that connection, and for that connection to be part of their building a sense of trust and resilience.
Yes, thank you. Carol has a question. Is there a model program that gets it that you might cite as an example?
When you say program, you mean a school-based program?
Yeah.
Yeah, when we work in schools, we don't do program, we do whole school. So it would be a school. And there are several schools in the Commonwealth that do this extraordinarily well. I don't know if you're looking for a particular grade level but I'm happy to point you in whatever direction would make sense.
Stipulate maybe an example that you can point out that you think's doing it really well.
Yeah, there are elementary schools that come right to the top of my head in Brockton and in New Bedford that are extraordinary schools that have provided trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive school communities for their students. The school in New Bedford was recently recognized as one of the 6 blue ribbon schools in the United States. And it's a school that works with extraordinarily diverse set of students, and 50% of their students are not native speakers, are English language learners, if you will.
That's remarkable.
And middle and high school, there are some schools up on the North Shore that have some really good programs, have created trauma-sensitive schools. That's
good to know. Thank you. It's nice to know that we can do it, and we should be able to do it in the urban areas you mentioned, which is terrific.
Yeah, and there's a tremendous amount of interest from teachers in creating safe and supportive trauma-sensitive classrooms and schools. At Leslie, we've delivered coursework to over 5,600 educators, the majority of them within the 495 belt of Boston.
Oh, nice. We have one last question, perhaps. What are some of the ways to help a child that is in a downward limbic spiral?
Oh, wow. Okay, so if what we're talking about is what is the way to structure that program, the first thing I would do is try and find a counselor who could work with that child, and I would highly recommend a cognitive behavior therapeutic approach, which is about reframing how that child is perceiving what's coming at them. Number one. Number two, I would work to create as much as I was able to help that child expand their network of communities and relationships that they feel comfortable with and safe and supported with.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I don't see another question. Do you have some final comments or words of hope you'd like to share with us?
Well, I will tell you the one thing that continues to amaze me when I look at those ACE study numbers, sometimes I get despondent. And then I go and I talk with students and I work with students. Our children are incredibly resilient by nature. They want to be successful. They want to do the right thing. And I am always buoyed by that resilience that they bring. And it constantly motivates me to continue to work with them in ways that assumes good intent and is working to support them to be who they want to be. And I would finish tonight by saying that I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all tonight, and very impressed by the insight from those early questions that you all had, and hope that I've been able to give you some helpful and useful information. Thank you very much.
Yes, I think you have, very much so. And we really appreciate you taking your time to be with us tonight. I'm delighted we had over 90 people sign up, and we had nearly 50 or more that actually were able to join us tonight. And everyone will be getting the video. So you will be spreading your pearls of wisdom, which we are very much appreciate. So thank you very much, Joel. We appreciate your being here.
You're welcome.
I want to say a thank you to Alex and Jessica who have been just once
thank
again
you.
marvelous in giving us the backup and the background here. So thank you. Thank everyone who was able to join us tonight. You will be getting a copy of this video. And please do watch it through the end of the questions because they were really good. I loved your answers. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to hear that so many good things are happening in these urban schools. Because that's very hopeful for me to think about as a former middle school principal, having worked in urban areas as well. It's delightful to know that that's possible. Gives me a lot of hope. So again, thank everyone for joining us tonight. I said my thank yous to my back team, which I'm delighted about. And once again, Joe, we are very, very, very honored that you took your time to be with us. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. And thank you to Jessica and Alexandra.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, I think we are 2 minutes over, ready to close. So good.
Thank you.